we are in the beef industry and we are producing meat, and so muscle is important both from a steer and a heifer standpoint. Steers, muscle, we may be selecting for more of the extreme muscle pattern. The heifers, we try to moderate that just a little bit. But when we're evaluating muscle, some key things to look at. One of the first things that I like to look at in evaluating these cattle is looking at their base width, looking at how naturally they stand with their feet apart, both in the front and the hind legs. The wider base they are, especially on those hind legs, typically that's going to mean that those cattle are more naturally thick and have true muscle. Because what happens is more internal muscle between those legs, okay, pushes those legs apart, and so we really get a good picture of how much muscle is in that particular animal. The key thing is too, when we're thinking about muscle and trying to differentiate an animal that's heavily muscled or an animal that's fat, muscle always has some shape and expression to it. It always has a round appearance to it. Fat, an animal when it fattens, it begins to take on a square or box look to it. And so if we're thinking about muscling, some key areas to look at. One, look at base width. The next thing I like to look at is look at down the top of the animal. Not only are we looking at width down the top, okay, width is important, okay, width across these hook bones is important, but we also want to evaluate how much shape down the top. And as you can see, we've got some shape into this animal, and it carries all the way from the hooks all the way to that shoulder. Now, one thing to evaluate and look at, an animal that has got some muscle to him, similar to this calf, you'll notice that he's got a roundness to his top, okay? It actually grooves down just a little bit and a little bit here. And so he has some muscle expression and some roundness and fullness as we evaluate him on both sides. Now, an animal that's a little bit lighter muscled may have some width, but the animal tends to taper off, more of a flat appearance rather than more of the shape like my hands are. And so we want animals, again, that have that roundness, they have that fullness and plumpness to the loin rather than more of a flat, tapered off appearance. They may start wider at the top, but that muscle tapers off and they're just not going to have as much muscling from end to end. And then we also, if we move into the round or to the rump portion of that animal, we want some width in his hips, width in the pin bone areas, but then also some fullness of those quarters. And if you'll notice on this particular steer, calf is really wide in his hip structure, but he also carries that muscle on down. And that's another key factor when we're thinking about the steers. If we evaluate this particular animal, he's wider base. So when viewed from behind, he looks more like a rectangle. Okay? Muscle carries from the top all the way down into his lower quarter and all the way into his stifle region as well. If this animal was narrow made, lighter muscled, he would probably take on more of a V shape. And so he may be wide up here, but his muscle would carry on down. He'd be not wider base and he'd be flatter and would not have that shape of that muscle there. So width from top to bottom, but we also like to see shape in these cattle as well. And if you'll notice, one key thing for me when looking at shape of cattle, look at them from behind, but then also look at them from the side as well. And you will see the shape and the dimension and how that muscle ties in here if we evaluate it. Also the twist area as well. We can also, to a lesser extent, evaluate the forearm of that animal and overall muscle expression. Key thing, muscle is round and fat is square, and look for that shape and be able to identify or differentiate the two. On steers, we may be looking at muscle that's heavier muscled, maybe a little more round in appearance. On heifers, we don't want the extreme on them from a muscle pattern. We like to see those heifers with a little bit longer, more tapered muscle pattern rather than a short, bunched up muscle in the particular animal. So muscle shape, extremely important when we're evaluating the project.